Provisionist perspective had written, Provisionists begin with God's revealed character, his justice, love, holiness, and sincerity, and therefore conclude that humans must possess free will. Now that's interesting. So evidently it's not an actual biblical teaching. It's based upon the character of God as understood by Provisionists as their starting point. And so they're agreeing there has to be a presuppositional starting point, and there is. The problem is that there's more to the presuppositional starting point than they're allowing, and that is God's holiness, God's purpose, God's eternality, God's immutability, and the fact that he's accomplishing all things according to the counsel of his will. Those unhappy verses that are there, okay? So then in response to Provisionist perspective, I found this fascinating. Now this sounds very much like what Dositheus was saying. That's why I wanted to bring this up. Is that on this, these guys could go smells, bells, incense any day because they're already on board with all this stuff. So Leighton Flowers says, yes, those who accuse Provisionists of starting with mankind instead of God have no idea what our true motivations are. That's me. Hi. I'm the guy who has said from the start that provisionism begins with man and not with God. But that's not about motivations. And if Leighton Flowers thinks that I've been talking about motivations all along, it just demonstrates he has never considered what we actually believe. Not once. When I say that provisionism begins with man, I'm talking about its fundamental presuppositional starting point is how man judges God's justice, love, holiness, and sincerity as understood by man. As you understand that. And what I've said from the beginning is you flatten out the testimony of Scripture because you take the human understanding of what these things must mean for human beings and limit God and his eternality and his decree and his providence based on that. You start with human categories, understandings of justice, love, holiness, and sincerity. Not biblical categories, because there's a bunch of places that you guys don't like where God does things that from a human perspective don't look like love, sincerity, justice, so on and so forth. Just talk to any one of the Egyptian soldiers under the Red Sea and ask them about their fair chance. How about it? So it struck me, he's thinking we're talking about motivations. I'm not talking about motivations at all. I'm talking about the vast difference between going, I want to believe tota scriptura in what it says about the existence of God, and then understand what God has done in the creation of man in light of that ultimate criterion, which is the actual revelation of God about himself. And we have documented over and over and over again, as provisionists, like Leighton Flowers, start down here to try to deny what's up here. It's just how they function. A defense of free will is primarily motivated by our belief in the goodness and trustworthiness of God and the blameworthiness of the free agent. How about basing it on what the Bible actually reveals when it talks about man's slavery to sin? How about basing it on the actual positive revelation of God that talks about his freedom and man's slavery, his ability and man's inability? How about we let the Scriptures define those things first and then talk about other things if we want to? But no. Whom God created with the capacity to do otherwise when he chooses to reject God's ways. Well, there we go. Man's capacity versus God's incapacity. That's provisionism. That's provisionism. In a phrase, right there. And it's perfectly in line with Dositheus. Perfectly in line with Dositheus. It's fascinating. It's fascinating to see how the things fit together.